Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Akram Khater. I'm a professor of history at North Carolina State University, where I also serve as director of the Khayrallah Center for Lebanese Diaspora Studies. Thank you for joining us today for this episode of Tarikh, our webinar series where we explore the history of the Levant and its diasporas through conversations with outstanding scholars. In these discussions, we hope to gain deeper insights into the history of the Eastern Mediterranean, which includes Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine, in all of its dimensions, be they political, economic, cultural, environmental, or social. Our focus will primarily be on the modern history of this area across the 19th and 20th centuries, but we'll certainly make forays into earlier periods as well. If there are particular topics or scholars that you would like to hear more about, then please let us know by emailing us at lebanesestudies@ncsu.edu. Now, before we begin, I'd like to share a little bit about our mission at the Khayrallah Center. We are dedicated to research about Lebanese immigrants in the United States and throughout the world, and to preserving and sharing that knowledge with the scholarly community and general public. On behalf of the center, I would like to welcome you today to this conversation with Dr. Jacob Norris. Dr. Norris is senior lecturer in Middle East history and co-director of the Middle East and North Africa Center at Sussex. He is also the admissions tutor for the Sussex History Department. Jacob's research looks at the social and cultural history of Palestine in the 19th and 20th century with a particular focus on the flows of Palestinian migration to Latin America. He also has an interest in the intersections between history and fictional writing. He completed his PhD in 2010 at the University of Cambridge, where he spent a further 3 years as research fellow before coming to Sussex in 2013. His first monograph, Land of Progress, Palestine and the Age of Colonial Development, 1905 to 1948, was published in 2013 by the Oxford University Press. From 2017 to 2019, he was an AHRC Leadership Fellow working on the project Merchants and Miracles, Global Circulations, and the Making of Modern Bethlehem. The fellowship led to the creation of the Planet Bethlehem Digital Archive and a monograph titled The Lives and Death of Jubrail Dabdoub, or How the Bethlehemites Discovered America, which came out with Stanford University Press in 2023. Jacob was visiting fellow at the Center for Latin American Caribbean Studies in London from September 2022 to January 2023. Jake, thank you so much for being with us today and welcome to this webinar.
Thank you, Akram, and a big thank you to the Khayrallah Center for hosting me.
It's our pleasure, and it's particularly my pleasure to be speaking with you today. So, Jake, before we start, I wanted to get our audience acquainted with your biography, your career. So I'm kind of curious, before we start talking about the books, which is The Lives and Death of Jubrail Dabdoub, if you can talk a little bit about your path to how you became a historian of the Middle East.
Yeah, sure. I came to the study of that area of the world relatively late on, I suppose. I did an undergraduate degree in London in history and Italian language. I was always very interested in language alongside history. In 2006, I went on a trip with a couple of friends to Syria and Lebanon, I remember. It was a very interesting time to be in that part of the world, and I was just really fascinated, eager to know more about that part of the world at a time when Muslim and particularly Arab countries and societies all over the world were being vilified. To sort of go beyond that surface level, I think it was a very kind of particular point in time for interest in Middle East and North Africa. So I decided to do a master's in London, Middle East studies, started studying Arabic. I think the kind of language side of things really always gripped me, and Arabic was a completely new kind of area of language to get into. And I've just found that really fascinating and sort of dived in from there. Ended up doing a PhD at Cambridge focused on the British Mandate in Palestine. And from that point, sort of, I guess, branched out from an initial starting point, which I suppose was more focused on British imperial history in the Middle East, to more sort of social and cultural history of Palestine. I was living in Bethlehem for quite a while during my PhD, doing research there, not specifically on Bethlehem, but using that as a base for all sorts of archival historical research that I was doing. And I just became very fascinated gradually by the local history in Bethlehem. Everybody I came across seemed to have an uncle, a cousin, a sister, an auntie on the other side of the world, especially in Latin America. And that wasn't something I was previously familiar with. So I just sort of started to dig into that. Very curious to find out about this, relatively small town with this interesting mixture of very kind of global sets of influences, and that led to this project of Bethlehem.
Which is a great segue. But before we get to the talking about the project itself, what I wanted to ask for those who have never been to Bethlehem is that if you can describe a little bit about what it looks like for them, just and how you sort of saw it as you sort of, and both in terms of a physical space, but also in terms of a social space, so that they get a little bit greater sense of it.
Yeah, it's a fascinating place. It's today it's very much kind of wider conurbation of the sort of old town of Bethlehem, which is something like 20 to 30,000 in terms of population, but that has very much kind of blended into a whole series of villages, 3 refugee camps created in 1948-49, and sort of wider urban sprawl. So you go to Bethlehem today and it feels in some ways like a lot of the larger Palestinian cities. You talk about the kind of interior hill country of Palestine, so it's set at something like 800 meters, and it kind of sprawls across the hills, and the old center is kind of within that, but within this much wider kind of urban sprawl. It's a fascinating place, and all of those factors I think make for a real mixture of influences, different waves of migration to the town. It also sits on the fault line of the Arab-Israeli conflict and the occupation of Palestine. The Israeli separation wall runs right through Bethlehem, 8 meters high. It's been absolutely disastrous for the town's economy. It's a town that has always really relied upon trade and outsiders being able to visit the town. It's like pilgrimage and tourism. So it's a town that's suffered a hell of a lot as well since, I would say, particularly in the last sort of 20 to 30 years. Historically, Bethlehem has been a majority Christian town. Today, that dynamic, that demographic has very much been reversed. If you take this kind of wider urban area, factoring in the 3 refugee camps and decades of migration from neighboring towns and villages. So that produces its own set of dynamics and sometimes tensions as well. I think there is this very strong sense amongst the old families of Bethlehem that we are the original Bethlehemites, and people, even by their accents in Arabic, are still distinguished as being sort of outsiders versus insiders. And sometimes it can feel like quite a sort of socially conservative place in that sense, compared to, say, a contrast would be Ramallah, which is a town kind of much more recently sort of exploded in terms of population, and everybody in Ramallah really is an immigrant of one kind or another. So it's a more sort of, in some ways, socially open atmosphere there, I would say. But on the other hand, Bethlehem also has these really interesting kind of cosmopolitan global influences for lots of reasons. It's obviously its huge kind of religious status has attracted for centuries all kinds of visitors and interest from outside, but also the fact that its own residents for a long time now, for well over a century, have been circulating the globe and bringing in all series of influences as they move in and out of the town. That's much harder to do now, I would emphasize, under the conditions of the Israeli occupation. It's much more difficult for people to come in, particularly if they want to sort of spend any length of time in Bethlehem, people of Bethlehem origin. If they want to set up businesses, if they want to sort of stay for longer periods, that's extremely difficult to do. So there is a sense that over time, some of that sort of global connectedness has actually been stifled and shut down.
Thank you for that description. So before we get into the main argument of the book, which does indeed focus on the peregrinations and travels and journeys and stays of many people from Bethlehem across the world, I'm kind of curious. I know that you said you began to discover from your residence there that there are all sorts of connections, that everybody in Bethlehem had at least one relative or friend or acquaintance or more who lived abroad, primarily in Latin America. So perhaps we can start talking a little bit more how that intriguing discovery turned into a book. I mean, what is it that, went from an observation to an idea for a book?
Yeah, thanks. I've been writing about Bethlehem in sort of articles for quite a long time. I suppose covering some of what I felt were the most significant aspects of that history, how this history of a single, quite small town, historically speaking, is actually quite significant for all sorts of wider regional histories and global histories. And I think with the book project, I was lucky enough to receive a grant from the UK Humanities Research Council, which was ostensibly to do two things. It was to set up a kind of a digital archive, working together with a group of people from Bethlehem and other areas, a particular filmmaker called Leila Sansour. And together we were sort of trying to draw together various sort of family collections of materials and make those available, share those online, which we've now done. That's called the Planet Bethlehem Archive, as you mentioned earlier. And the other part of that grant was ostensibly to write a book, so to pull together a lot, all those years of research that I'd been doing into some kind of monograph project. Writing an article is one thing, right? When you have a specific sort of, I suppose, scholarly question or hypothesis that you want to explore. To do that in a book project, I always found, in the case of this particular history, very, very challenging, because I'd essentially been researching Bethlehem's history of global migrations and circulations as a series of family histories. These are not actors who tend to be very visible in institutional archives, be they state archives, corporate archives, etc. They weren't great sort of writers of extensive memoirs and diaries and those kind of things. So it's through family stories, family histories, photographic collections, memorabilia, sometimes sort of shipping records, piecing together various parts of that jigsaw, but largely along sort of familial and genealogical lines. And I found that very beguiling, trying to bring all of those family histories together into one narrative. There are dozens and dozens of Bethlehemite families who in the 19th century began to travel all over the world, and on the whole were very successful in businesses that they set up. These were businesses trading, initially at least, in devotional objects. Bethlehem became a very important and well-known center of artisanal devotional objects carved from mother of pearl and olive wood. And these Bethlehem merchants became very successful at selling and marketing those around the world. And each one of those families sort of spread out in multiple directions and has its own stories to tell in very different locations around the world. We're really talking about sort of all corners of the world here, at least in the initial phase. Later, it became more concentrated on Latin America. So I was looking for a way to try and condense that into something which didn't feel sort of overwhelming, something that was, I guess, that would allow myself and readers to kind of grasp how that looked at the kind of granular detail, even at sort of the personal level. And in the end, for me, the solution to that was to sort of focus on one particular family and even one individual within that family. So I was sort of drawing together a series of sources related to the Dabdoub family, one of these sort of early, what we might call the pioneer families from Bethlehem, who struck out in the sort of 1860s, 1870s. And yeah, there was sort of various characters kicking around who were potential people to focus on in that project. The decision was made for me when I came across this extraordinary event of one man from that family, Jubrail Dabdoub, being brought back to life from the dead by a local nun, a woman called Marie Alphonsine. And this woman was canonized by the Vatican in 2015, and that's when she came to my attention. And I started to sort of look into her life because I knew that she had lived in the 19th century, late 19th century in Bethlehem. And lo and behold, I came across in the records of this religious order that she founded, the Rosary Sisters, a description of her bringing this guy Jubrail Dabdoub back to life. And that sort of made the decision for me, that kind of moment of historical serendipity just made me realize, okay, this is the guy that we're going to write the book about. Also because it opened up a different element of the experience of these merchants, no longer being necessarily solely rational economic agents, but also that there was another aspect to their lives which maybe I hadn't fully considered before. So it was a productive space to explore, I suppose, the connection between piety and trade and faith and migration, these kinds of questions.
I really love that story about finding Jubrail Dabdoub. So let's talk a little bit about the main argument that you're trying to present through the life of Jubrail Dabdoub. So for those who will read the book, what is it that you're trying to argue? And I'm going to come back to your style, and we'll talk more about the archives in connection with the style that you approach, because one can call it unorthodox from a scholarly historical point of view, or I think more appropriately it would be called incredibly creative, and we can talk about that more. But I'm kind of curious if you can talk a little bit about, so as you were writing this and spitting out from very flimsy material the life of this man, one individual, and telling a story. What is the story that you're really trying to tell here?
Yeah, it makes me realize that given that as you said, we'll come back to this, the book is written in the style of a novel. It makes the process of constructing arguments a little bit different. You can't spell it out in analytical terms as kind of directly. And maybe that influenced the fact that I think the book, if there are arguments to be drawn from it, I think they operate on multiple levels. At the sort of immediate level, there's the story of this singular Palestinian town, and trying to understand how and why it is that merchants from Bethlehem became so successful very, very suddenly, in a very short space of time. I would say Bethlehem, between roughly 1870 and 1900, went from being a pretty poor, in some ways kind of regular Palestinian hill town, market town, to being probably the richest town. I mean, it's difficult to measure these things, but newspaper reports at the time remarked that by around the turn of the century, it was the most kind of spectacularly kind of wealthy Palestinian town. So how did that occur in such a short space of time? And for me, it was really this quite ruthlessly patriarchal business model which Bethlehem families managed to establish in that time. They were very adept at drawing upon a long history in the town of interaction with Roman Catholic Europeans, particularly the Franciscan community, which has been present in Bethlehem since at least the 1350s. So in Bethlehem, you have a long history of people being well-versed in Western European languages, especially Italian and French, but also the Roman Catholic faith. Bethlehem is the only town in the whole of the wider Ottoman Empire which has a kind of majority Roman Catholic population by the late 1600s, early 1700s. We're not talking about uniate churches here, such as the Maronites or the Melkites. We're talking about direct adherence to the Roman Catholic Church through this relationship with the Franciscans. And what happens in the mid-19th century, really for decades, if not centuries, the Bethlehemites have been trying to export these devotional objects that they produce and really being held back by the Franciscans. It's a relationship of tension. The Franciscans buy these products from the Bethlehemites, and they sell them to visiting pilgrims, but they also export them back to Europe. And there are archives, particularly in the Vatican, the Franciscan archives, which tell us quite a lot about that trade. But they were very keen to keep the Bethlehemites in their place as just local producers. And there are lots of examples of the Bethlehemites trying to travel abroad and being sometimes physically restrained and held back by the Franciscans. By the mid-19th century, the Bethlehemites are starting to become a bit shrewder in terms of how they sell their goods. They're opening the first shops in Bethlehem, but also then they're able to piggyback on all of the kind of new technologies of 19th century industrial capitalism, steam travel in particular. By the 1860s, 70s, steam travel is becoming not necessarily affordable to the average person, but certainly it's becoming more of a possibility for those who are able to accrue some capital, which the Bethlehemites are doing through these shops in Bethlehem itself. And like I said, this ruthlessly patriarchal business model there. You tend to have one patriarch sitting at the top of a very sort of pyramid-like structure, sending out young men. This is a very gendered kind of migration in the early stages. Sending out young men aged sometimes as young as 16, 17, typically late teens, early 20s, to sort of test out the possibilities for trade in various parts of the world. It begins really in the international exhibitions in Europe. Paris, 1867, Vienna, 1873. The Bethlehemites are there trading and have some success there. Later in the US, they're there in Philadelphia, 1876. And from there, they start to sort of build up connections and go in all directions. They go eastwards through the Suez Canal across the Indian Ocean to places like Singapore and the Philippines. They go northwards to places like the Russian Empire, Kiev in particular. They go southwards to parts of East Africa, but above all, they go westwards across the Atlantic Ocean to particularly Central and South America. So it's that, I suppose, on one level, relatively kind of locally specific story of this town that has quite an exceptional, unusual history of its religious status and being able to exploit a long-standing connection to Catholic Europe. But then that sort of, on top of that, I suppose, we can build lots of relevance for how we understand certainly Palestinian history in that period more broadly. I think it has been a real trend within Palestinian historiography, whichever sort of side of the fault lines you sit on, to see Palestinians as passive recipients, often victims of globalizing forces, primarily Zionism and British colonialism, but also the way in which the world economy kind of hits Palestine in the mid to late 19th century. And examples like the Bethlehemites, I think, just remind us that the story is much more complicated than that. The Palestinians, the Bethlehemites are one example of that, but Palestinians generally were testing that out. They were actively sort of engaging in these new circuits of globalization, and playing around with that in ways which go far beyond this kind of static recipient of global forces that we're often used to seeing Palestinians as. And the Bethlehemites were the sort of pioneers in that sense, but very soon, by the 1880s, 1890s, towns like Ramallah, Beit Sahur, Beit Jala, Al-Bira, which is a Muslim town, so these aren't all Christians. Ramle is another one. Many people from Jerusalem as well, Nazareth, are leaving Palestine and sort of following that Bethlehemite model. So that's another level of sort of how do we understand Palestinian history and its relationship to globalization. And then the final one would be sort of zooming out further, these wider histories of migration out of Bilad al-Sham, the sort of Arabic-speaking regions of the Eastern Mediterranean in the late Ottoman Empire. And I think the Bethlehemites play a really important role within that wider process. There are countless examples from Australia to the Philippines to Brazil to Mexico, Haiti, the list goes on, where if you read and speak to sort of community memories or written accounts, how did the wider kind of Syro-Lebanese community in Brazil, how was it founded? The account that you'll hear is that the first people to come here from Bilad al-Sham were typically two brothers from Bethlehem selling Holy Land goods. You will have heard this countless times yourself, Akram. And I've come to actually appreciate that there is a lot of truth to that. In many cases, not all cases, but in many cases, the Bethlehemites sort of opened up or suggested new routes of travel, and not just the travel, but the trade. The trade is crucial here. Again, as you know well, Akram, this idea of sort of cashing in on your status as being from the Holy Land, creating some kind of brand out of that, I guess, becomes something which tens of thousands of people from the wider kind of Syrian region, especially from Mount Lebanon, adopt as their kind of entry point into trade as peddlers, as itinerant traders. Amin Rehani's Book of Khalid famously satirizes this. In 1911, supposedly sort of first Arab-American novel, is very autobiographical, right? Rehani himself made those journeys in the 1880s. And not by chance, in that novel, the two main characters, Shakib and Khalid, start out in New York peddling these fake Holy Land goods, which they pick up in Marseille en route to on the Via Dolorosa, as Rehani describes it. So, and that's not something that Rehani's invented. He's drawing personal experience there. So the way in which this whole kind of industry, based, factories churning in New York and Marseille, churning out all these kind of fake Holy Land goods, is something that is based upon the success of the Bethlehemites in part. And the Bethlehemites are very aware of this. They go to exhibit in Philadelphia, for example. There are reports of all these, even kind of non-Arabic speakers, famous or notoriously in Philadelphia, some Irish traders were trying to sell Holy Land goods. And the Bethlehemites very deliberately start to try to on the one hand, avoid these larger flows of Lebanese Syrian migrants because they're being crowded out. If they want to sort of sell their products, they can't, they're crowded out of the marketplace. And so they keep sort of searching out areas which the larger numbers Syrians and Lebanese haven't yet reached. And that's a big part of the reason why they end up crossing the Andes at an early stage, and Chile becomes the single biggest recipient of Palestinians, specifically Bethlehemite migration from the 1880s onwards. And the other thing they do is they go to great lengths to try and distinguish themselves from from what they see as the kind of inauthentic imitators. You find lots of interesting examples of Bethlehemite shops in the names and the way they present their goods. As, you know, we are the original, we're the real Holy Land, the real sellers of Holy Land goods. Don't believe the fake imitators. There's examples like a shop in New York that the Dabdoub family has actually called Beit Lahm al-Yahudiya, which in the very early 20th century I was very interested in. So that's Jewish Bethlehem is the name of their shop. And it turns out this is sort of very much, it's difficult for us to get our heads around this from today's kind of standpoint of Jewish and Arab being seen as binary opposites. But I think in that much earlier period, it was a sign of sort of a signal to Bethlehem, the city of David, a biblical Bethlehem, and sort of saying we're the ancient sort of Bethlehemite heritage, rather than all of these peddlers of Holy Land trinkets that surrounded them in a city like New York.
I really love those stories that you shared, Jake. And yeah, I mean, I do remember that a lot of people, you know, from Louisiana all the way to Montana were peddling supposedly these relics or, you know, as you know, trinkets from the Holy Land. I mean, that becomes, and there's a whole circuit of preachers who go around, you know, proclaiming that. So it is really quite interesting that the Bethlehemites had to kind of, you know, reclaim the brand, so to speak. But it seems to me, I mean, you talked about these three levels, from the local to, you know, the regional to the more global migration pattern. But also, I mean, it seems to me that a lot of what you're working on, especially with the story of how these folks were engaged in trade, is about the story of capitalism, right? I mean, so traditionally speaking, you know, modernization theory, at least until recently, held that capitalism is born in a very specific region, primarily Western Europe. And from there, you know, and then the United States, and from there it expands to the rest of the world. Again, it's kind of a monodirectional actors versus recipients, metropole or the center versus the periphery models. But yet it appears that what you wrote about these traders in general is that they themselves were shaping capitalism and they were shaping it, quote unquote, from the periphery. So it seems to me that it also undermines very much some of the central tenets and revisits the history of capitalism. So that's really a very valuable part of the story. So let's talk a little bit about Jubrail Dabdoub. Yeah, you said that what really kind of helped you focus, you know, that serendipity moment, is that he was brought back from the dead by Marie Alphonsine, who was beatified in 2015 by the Vatican. And so what is it about, I mean, clearly it's a very dramatic moment and it's really quite great for a narrative, but there's a whole lot. You tell a story from when he was a child, waiting for a relative to come back and tell him about America, and he was enthralled about the stories, you know, in full tension as the guy talks about crossing 30 days across Atlasy or the Atlantic Ocean. So I'm kind of curious what else beyond this story made Jubrail Dabdoub such an important and central character in your brilliant book, really. And how did you go about narrating his story? So this gets us to the point about, you know, how did you find out about this man? And what is it about him that was compelling beyond the miracle?
Yeah, I think it's a mixture of some very interesting details connected to his life that made him stand out to me. But then on the other hand, also being, on my part, being open about the fact that there's a hell of a lot I don't know about his life, and using those silences as a kind of creative space to think about how do we narrate history? What do we do with a group of actors? We don't really leave behind, on the whole, very substantial kind of written documentary evidence. So in terms of the kind of details of his life, he was very much on my radar already before before my realization that he was a recipient of a miracle from this nun, Marie Alphonsine. He was part of that generation. He was born in 1860. At the age of 17 or 18, he heads off with his elder brothers to the Paris exhibition of 1878. And then by 1881, he's appearing in the Philippines. The first that we've been able to sort of find, at least, the first kind of Ottoman Arab trader in the Philippines of that sort of modern era, if you like. Of course, there's longer histories of Arab traders in the Pacific and various areas of Southeast Asia, but of that era, he's the first amongst a discernible wave of Syrian, Palestinian, Lebanese peddlers and merchants, and there's a community of probably tens of thousands of these people by the turn of the 20th century. And so he's the first one in the Spanish colonial records, him and another young man from Bethlehem called Anton Saadi. So it's just very, that really stood out to me, because it's much better known that these merchants went to Latin America in particular. There are large Bethlehemite communities in Chile, Honduras, El Salvador today, but the kind of eastwards movements were much kind of less known to me and have been largely forgotten in Bethlehem itself. So that seemed like an interesting point of departure, in a way, to explore the globality of those early migrations. And his wider family certainly was one of those families which had they built possibly the first house in Bethlehem. This was a house where Jubrail would have been born around 1859, 1858, outside of the kind of cluster of the old town of Bethlehem, outside of the old, I mean, they're no longer really surviving, but the old Mamluk walls up the hillside out of Bethlehem, a deliberate attempt to catch the arriving pilgrims and visitors to Bethlehem, where they opened their shop and had a lot of success. So that was a kind of stepping stone to these migrations. So he was an interesting character. He was part of that generation, and I had some sort of interesting sources, material, and a collection of letters that he had written a bit later on in his life, business letters, some visual sources. And then the miracle, really, when I found out about the miracle, that was confirmation for me that, okay, we're going to try and condense this into a sort of single, more personalized narrative. This is the person to go with. But as I said, at the same time, he's still a huge mystery to me as well. I've never seen an image of what he looked like. There are lots of photos where I think, wedding photos, for example, where I think he's probably in that photo, and you're scanning the kind of people of his age. Is that him? Is that not him? But I've never sort of had a confirmed sighting of him in that sense. So there's the visual side of things, and like pretty much all the migrants, the merchants of his generation, they rear their head. They sort of surface from time to time in a shipping record, an immigration record, in a business directory here and there, but the periods in between are populated often by silences. So then the question obviously arises, okay, if we're going to try and tell this through the eyes of one person and his wider family, what do we do with those silences? And there are multiple ways that historians can and do experiment with those silences. People create composite historical characters, people write in the conditional, people do all sorts of things to try to interrogate those gaps. In my case, I became increasingly drawn to the idea of trying to write a continuous narrative, as if the whole book was a sort of a novel playing out. Particularly because the idea, at least for me, and this was drawing inspiration from various people, from Walter Benjamin to sort of more modern day historians like Saidiya Hartman, or people like Marjorie Becker, who wrote about a priest in Mexico in the 1920s, all sort of different influences. But for me, the idea was to use the story in a way as a commentary on what the story is about. So the style of writing can become a kind of a reflection or a metaphor for the content of the history itself. And this started to sort of be developed in my mind shortly after I found out about the miracle, because I was trying to make sense of this miracle and these connections between piety and trade. and I wrote some draft chapters. I went to conference. I did some conference presentations. I got very interested in theory, anthropological theories, really, of miracles, but also gift giving, reciprocity, patronage. And I sort of tried to rationalize, I guess, this relationship between this local nun, Marie Alphonsine, and Jubrail and the other merchants in Bethlehem. And it seemed like there was some sort of relationships of patronage going on there, which was quite interesting, which is all very well. And I think that's an important area to explore. But I just had this nagging feeling from the sources that I had seen, including an account of the miracle written by Marie Alphonsine herself, that I was leaving out almost the most important part, which is the miracle itself, what actually happened when he'd been declared dead from typhoid fever. The priest was there, had read his last rites. To all intents, to everyone that, as far as everyone there was concerned, he was dead. Marie Alphonsine enters sometime later, dips her prayer beads in water, her rosary beads in water, starts to pray the rosary to the Virgin Mary, and whispers some words into his ear, gives him some quince jam to eat, and he miraculously comes back to life. And it seems like from all the kind of accounts that I'd come across, everybody there genuinely believed that some kind of supernatural intervention had occurred, specifically through the presence of the Virgin Mary. And so I was just very aware that I was kind of leaving all of this out in my kind of theorizing and rationalizing of the miracle. So I became very interested in anthropologists who embrace what's called the ontological turn. So these are anthropologists who are very much into the idea that people experience reality in very different ways, because they inhabit very different worlds that can't be explained in terms of universally sort of intelligible symbols, right? So Eduardo Viveiros de Castro here, the Brazilian anthropologist with big influence, he sort of says this: we have to accept and embrace a universe peopled by different types of subjective agency. And so in the case of Jubrail's miracle, I began to try and sort of rewrite that as an actual passage playing out in terms of the day itself, the day he was brought back to life. And I thought, well, how can I write this as a historian? My training as a historian doesn't really give me the tools to enter into that terrain of experience. So I started to turn to fiction, and the more I kind of thought about it and read and looked into it, the more I was drawn to the idea of a specific genre of fiction, magical realism, which seemed to me very suitable. And the more I went on, not just for this miracle, but actually the book as a whole. And it was quite daunting at first, because I'm certainly not trained in it. I have no claims to kind of literary skill of any kind, but nevertheless, I thought it's an interesting experiment to, by adopting a certain style of writing, how can we kind of use that as a commentary on the history itself, or on certain aspects of that past experience that had stood out to me in sources, which perhaps a more, if you like, academic tone of writing wouldn't be so adept at capturing. Why magical realism? Magical realism is well known for magical realism isn't fantasy. As a genre, it's very, very different. The realism part of magical realism is very important. Magical realist writers of various kinds ground their stories in very detailed, intimately sort of constructed historical realities. And it's the intrusion, sort of quite unexpectedly often, of what we might think of as supernatural events, which makes it often quite startling and quite distinctive as a genre. So magical realism works quite well as a mode of historical communication in that sense, because it's grounded in these very detailed historical realities. The other thing that magical realism often plays around with is our expectations of what is normal and what's abnormal, what is expected and what's unexpected. So magical realism often works very well for telling stories of communities that are very much grounded in the kind of, if you like, the mystical or the fantastical elements of everyday existence, that's just part of your life, and often that's narrated in a very mundane way by magical realist authors. At the same time, or on the other hand, magical realism classically is, it treats things like modern technologies, the incursion of colonial powers, or the creation of new nation states as very bizarre, arresting, often sort of fantastical, unfathomable processes. So it's turning on its head our sort of ideas of what's normal and what's not normal, what's rational and what's irrational. And for that reason, it's appealed to a broad range of authors from across the world, but particularly I would say in the global south. I know there are a lot of debates about is there a danger of kind of lumping large, diverse traditions of writing into kind of one label. But I think there are a lot of writers, including the Arabic world, who have adopted very self-consciously, played around with the magical realist form as a way of expressing a particular type of experience. So I guess I just went from there. Like I say, not claiming any literary merit, but in a way kind of copying some of the classic tropes of magical realist writing. I'm sure I do it very badly, but as a comment, like I said, as a commentary on the history itself. What are the sorts, from Garcia Marquez to Isabel Allende to Salman Rushdie, the Syrian Kurdish writer, Salim Barakat was a big influence, Emil Habibi, the Palestinian writer. And what are the kind of classic tricks that they do, or techniques, devices that they do in order to kind of portray this this arresting experience of reality? And so I sort of peppered the book with those, and I sort of tried to pull out elements of Jubrail's life, or imagine elements of his life, which could be sort of crafted or shaped into that sort of magical realist style of narration. I've tried, and there's an author's commentary at the back of it, and I've tried to be very clear that this is not me saying this is some kind of definitive reality, that this is somehow a kind of exact recreation of how Bethlehem looked, or how Bethlehemites' journeys looked. Rather, it's an attempt just to capture a certain mood that came across to me in the sources, or a certain element of past experience, which maybe normally gets put to one side or doesn't get addressed by historians. Personally, I think that historians can never recreate the past in all of its exact detail. The past is gone. In that sense, we distinguish between the past and history. They're two very, very different things. So all we're left with really is our impressions, our attempt to sort of recreate that through various devices and narratives.
I have to say, it really is a highly successful book. It really is path-breaking in many ways within our field, Middle East studies and migration studies. But it really is, you kept saying that you don't make any claims to being, inclined in a literary sense. But quite honestly, I think it's a very brilliant read. I mean, it's really quite engaging as a story. And I think that has the added element, to me anyway, of making history accessible in terms of languages, because sometimes, when we get very much deeply involved in theorizing, we forget the humanity of the story. And I think what's really amazing about it is that it's very accessible at a human level. That's engaging, even as it's making larger arguments without being pedantic about the larger arguments that you're making. But and I do think that what you said about how it flips the script is really important, because first of all, the claim of older traditions of positivist history, of the idea of finding the truth with a capital T, is a farcical claim at many levels, because we're only trying to recreate a past that we can never recreate. And so there's always a magical realism to whatever book we read, or inventive, filling in the blanks, so to speak, if you will, but also that you are taking a tradition that exists within people's lives. Because I think in many ways historical writing has separated the supernatural from the day-to-day natural. And in people's lives, especially in the 19th century, but I would argue even today, that separation is artificial at best. For most people, the supernatural is still very real, and if nothing else, we have to show respect to how they approach it and narrate that. So I think you do that beautifully, actually. But I want to go back to this point where you emphasize it's realism, right? It's not like you're making things up as you go along. So perhaps you can kind of walk us through very briefly in how you imagined the material that fills in the gaps. Because clearly there are huge gaps in the story, right? Between the material that you can read, it's like, Jubrail Dabdoub got on a ship, and then, 5 years later, Jubrail Dabdoub came back, right?
Basically, yeah.
You know, there's very little about his character. So, I mean, as you sort of trying to draw on other material, how is it that you went about filling in these gaps?
Yeah, that's the big question. I think first and foremost, I wanted to be very open about the process. So in order to let this experiment kind of play out fully, the book itself is written in as a continuous kind of narrative. But then at the back of the book is a relatively, even by academic standards, I think, lengthy endnote section. So almost every paragraph of each chapter, the very short chapters have got sort of 19 chapters in there, I think, but each chapter is like 3-4 pages, or sometimes a bit more. But almost every paragraph has sort of footnotes in there, and those who want to, those who are masochistic enough to want to go and dig deeper, can then sort of read my explanation, I suppose, of why I've chosen to describe it in a certain way. And where possible, the approach for me was always to draw on kind of material evidence, on I suppose empirically viable, sort of verifiable sources. And that was one of the advantages of writing a book about time that I'd already been working on as a historian for, on and off for almost 10 years. So over the years, had collected a vast amount of source material, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously. Files on my computer and old stacks of folders in my office, trying to rummage through things to find, all sorts of random obscure details. But yeah, I was able to draw upon a long period of research to do that, often not directly about Jubrail himself. Like I said, this started out as a project of sort of following multiple families. So the technique often was to sort of say, okay, well, in this particular instance, Jubrail traveling on a steamship, for example. Okay, I don't have his own personal sort of description of that, but we do have one or two from there's a cousin of his, for example, who wrote a memoir, very roughly written, colloquial Bethlehemite Arabic, never published, just sort of just held in a private collection in Bethlehem, which the family very generously shared with me. Who did talk about traveling on a steamship for the first time to Marseille in the 1870s. So just sort of widening that net as much as possible in order to imagine certain scenes playing out. And then being as open as possible in the endnotes as well. So where I have sort of just literally invented a scene, I'm very sort of explicit about that. So this is my imagination of how this kind of scene might have played out, but using these are some of the sources which have helped me to try to imagine that. So I know a lot of people disagree with me on this sort of process, but for me, that in a way is just a more sort of open way of talking about the role of the historian. In this way, it's looser, definitely, than probably the majority of certainly academic historiography. But I think that process sits at the heart of all the work that we do as historians. Another thing I wanted to add is that I was acutely aware of my own positionality within this whole process. As a historian from the UK, visiting Bethlehem as an outsider, however much I tried to study Arabic, I'm not going to speak Arabic as a Bethlehem that speaks Arabic. I'm always going to be an outsider. And from the UK, especially, you have a kind of uncomfortable mixture of distance, but also colonial proximity. There's a very recent colonial British history in Palestine, of course. So who am I to make sort of authoritative claims about this society 120, 130 years ago? And for me, writing the text in the form of a kind of a novel was actually a way of making that more explicit. That this is me, the historian, almost as the crafter, the stealer of stories. And to make that role, my position, very sort of to be very upfront about that. This is one way that I, as a historian, can very artificially, I suppose, place a construct, which is in my text as a historian, in order to give you my thoughts, my interpretations of this history, but it's certainly not the singular definitive version. And magical realism, again, was particularly good for that, I found, because as a genre, unlike some other genres, magical realism, you always feel the presence of the narrator quite strongly. The narrator is a weaver of stories. Sometimes in magical realism, you get the sense of the unreliable narrator. That wasn't something that I went for so much in this book, but certainly you're very aware that somebody's telling you a story in magical realism, albeit a story grounded in quite sort of detailed, constructed locale and society. So it worked quite well from that point of view.
It works beautifully, actually. I thought it was, we could go on talking. I love the book. Just as a disclaimer, I actually was an external reader for the Stanford University Press, and I fell in love with the book. And to be honest, when I first started reading it, I was a bit skeptical at the first element, but by page 3, I was sucked in.
That's very kind of you, Akram. That's very kind.
And I
don't think it's
by the end of the book, I was completely convinced that this was a brilliant approach that you took, and it made a lot of sense in general, but specifically for the project that you had undertaken. Anyway, so I could talk on more and more about this, but we have limited time. So I just want to conclude by asking about your future projects. Where are you going from here? What is the next stage for you?
Yeah, well, it's been fascinating because it was a project that took me to many different parts of the world to, over the years, researching those movements of the Bethlehemites and discovering this rich history of Palestinians in Latin America, especially. The vast majority of people of Palestinian origin in Latin America trace their origins to the Bethlehem area. By the Bethlehem area, I mean Bethlehem and the surrounding historic villages of Beit Jala and Beit Sahur. And so through sort of familiarizing myself and spending time in some of those countries, particularly in Central America to start with at least, I've become quite interested in the more, I suppose, the more localized histories of those communities. And I think the next project, as it seems to be kind of panning out, is one about Palestinians' involvement in radical revolutionary political movements in Latin America and in its later time period, really, 1950s, 60s, and into the 70s. On the whole, the Palestinians in countries like Honduras, El Salvador, Chile, they're the countries with the largest proportions of Palestinians. They tend to be known for their political conservatism. They've been, in some cases, particularly in Central America, they constitute economic elites, so they've tended to be quite kind of protective, I suppose, of their economic status, and quite sort of skeptical or weary of any kind of radical politics, which creates an uneasy relationship with Palestine itself, right? Because especially since the sort of what's now talked about as the Palestinian Thawra, the Palestinian Revolution that's launched in the 1960s. That's a movement which is steeped in anti-colonialism, in often leftist politics. By its very kind of statelessness, adopts quite radical anti-establishment positions. So it's quite interesting in those dynamics. And it turns out actually there are, not necessarily the majority of people, but significant numbers of young Palestinians or people of Palestinian origin in the 1950s onwards in South America and Central America, joining kind of revolutionary causes, and in some cases connecting that back to Palestine. So it's a sort of, in a way, it's a story of the Palestinian Revolution turned inside out. How does that look from Latin American perspective? So that's where it's going.
That sounds like a great project, and quite honestly, I mean, I think that's something that several scholars are also beginning to look at, how to move beyond first the idea that there's a single diaspora narrative to the fact that there are many diasporas and the experience of diaspora is dramatically different, but also to move away from the bourgeois story of respectability, in which we worked hard, we made money, and we became accepted, and there are obviously political, and in some cases in the United States and Australia and South Africa, racial reasons why they needed to do that. But the fact is they completely ignore and elide the history of, third world connections, labor unionism, feminism, queer politics. I mean, the kind of stuff that is really not talked about. The stories, though, we do not tell usually. And so I think this would be really a very amazing addition to the scholarship as it's shifting away from that kind of bourgeois narrative. Jake, I want to thank you so much for taking the time. I know you have a very busy schedule, so I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today. And I look forward to your next book. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Akram. I'm very honored by your positive comments about the book. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us for today's conversation with Dr. Jacob Norris, and we hope that you will join us again in future webinars.